everyone? I come here today with a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, I intend to argue that humanity's greatest essence is creativity. Creativity is that process in which human beings enact physical changes in the natural world. These can include in the relationships we nurture, in the technologies we invent, and the art we dream up. On the other hand, I will be upfront with the fact that I've never had an original thought in my entire life. I consider myself to be a fairly creative person. I like to read, write, research, and every now and then I like to write music for fun. But still, I will maintain that I've never had an original idea in my entire life, and neither has anybody else. I imagine it'd be a good time to point to some of the most influential minds of the past. The Marie Curies, Albert Einsteins, Nikola Teslas, and Sojourner Truth of the world. This is just a tiny selection of some of world history's greatest thinkers. They too have never had an original idea in their entire lives. Mark Twain once wrote to Helen Keller about much of the same. He says, "As if there is much of anything in any human utterance, oral or written, except plagiarism. For the kernel, the soul of all human utterances is plagiarism. For substantially all ideas are secondhand, consciously and unconsciously drawn from a million outside sources." I generally subscribe to a field of philosophy known as materialism. Materialism, at its core, argues that the material physical world exists primary to all other aspects of life, including thoughts, ideas, the mind, consciousness, and free will itself. As a precondition materialism, this world exists before human beings, and it will exist after. Our role as humans, then, is to exert our influence on the natural world, for better or for worse. To take a bit of a philosophical detour for a moment, I will ask the following. What, if anything, makes us uniquely human? For one, human beings seem to exhibit certain innate drives or instincts. These include drives to eat, sleep, live, love, and exist. These are not uniquely human, but exist among all life on Earth. My pet cat Scout likes to eat, sleep, and defecate just as much as I do, if not a little bit more. What she does not seem to exhibit is a drive to creatively express herself. She does not pursue creative tasks for the process of creativity itself. This is uniquely human. It also relies on the material world. It is collective, in the sense that it includes the day you stubbed your toe, graduated from university, and had your first kiss. It is a process in which human beings take what was left over by other people and reshape it into something different. This is our essence of humanity. The collective cooperation of human beings and nature for the continual revision of both. In short, we are the material world, and the material world is us. For much of human history, creativity and productivity operated on a fundamentally collective and public basis. Recent anthropological data has actually shown that life within pre-industrial societies was overwhelmingly abundant. It was this abundance in resources like land, water, air, and crops that allowed people, artisans, farmers, and producers to fulfill their creative desires as they saw fit, to fulfill their daily needs day by day. It was actually only beginning in the 16th century that British lords and ladies began to enclose large subsets of previously public and collective land, taking it, retracting it from the peasantry, and giving it into the hands of a fewer and fewer aristocratic elite. This era saw the rise of the world's first working class, a group of people who had no means to subsist other than by selling their labor to a prominently wealthy landlord. For the first time in history, our essence of humanity was constrained. Today, the same process of enclosure is operating on a new front, this time in the form of ideas, the mind, thoughts themselves. It comes in the form of intellectual property law, and it has three distinct effects on our creative capacities. The first being that it tends to lead to the underuse of technologies and ideas among people who stand to benefit from them the most. Take, for example, the skyrocketing prices of goods like university textbooks, scholarly journals, magazines, and newspapers. The prices of these materials is all hugely inflated because of the artificial scarcity imposed by intellectual property law. It's further ironic that the funds used to pay for these grants, public grants, government grants, are often paid for by the same people who generally don't have access to these materials in the first place. The areas of global health are similarly affected. For example, golden rice was a grain of rice that scientists use to increase its rates and concentrations of vitamin A. It was meant to combat child blindness and child mortality in the global south. However, Its production and distribution in the area was made hugely unprofitable by certain patent laws and legal regulations. We are in the process of coming out of a COVID-19 pandemic. Before COVID-19, epidemics including HIV, hepatitis, and other diseases like malaria and Ebola had devastating impacts in countries in the global south. Just as before, the medicines used to treat these diseases were made hugely unprofitable to sell among people who needed them most. Intellectual property, therefore, tends to harm the world's sick, the world's hungry, and the world's poor the most. The second effect I'd like to talk about is that intellectual property laws and their enactment tend to lead people to share ideas much less. For an idea to remain profitable, it has to be scarce. For an idea to be scarce, it has to be owned by a single individual, either one person or more often an individual company or corporation. Since it is owned by a company or corporation, it is hoarded for oneself, for the good of profit. This discounts collective research at the expense of genuine progress. I actually have some quantitative data to back this up too, because recent research undertaken by scholars Michael Heller and Rebecca Eisenberg have actually found that within the last few decades, researchers at universities have become more and more preoccupied with securing patents for their work at the expense of genuine research itself. These patents act as innovatory roadblocks, red tape, that encloses large subsets of previously public knowledge and made them inaccessible for further research. The quest for knowledge, therefore, has been effectively replaced by a quest for ownership. Both of these effects have had devastating impacts on our creative potentials as human beings. One of the most noticeable areas is in the arts, film, television, and music. The way our current paradigm functions, most artists generally do not own the work that they actually produce. Instead, it is subject to the demands of corporations, producers, and executives, and often property law itself. For example, musician John Fogerty once released a batch of songs that his label deemed to sound too much like his previous material. He was sued. He was effectively sued for sounding like himself. We effectively tell artists that they cannot capture the world as it actually exists. In film and television, entire scenes have been scrapped and entire movies postponed because bits of property have been seen in passing shots. These include maybe a car, a logo, a bit of architecture like a home or a building. We tell artists that they cannot capture the natural world. They can only capture a perversion of this world, which has been artificially sterilized to remove anything that might be deemed the product of someone else. To quote American film director Davis Guggenheim, "The cost for me is creativity. Suddenly the world that you're trying to create is completely generic and void of the elements that you would normally create." The advent of intellectual property law, therefore, is eerily akin to being put in a locked white room and being told that all other external influences simply do not exist. They're not yours to use, they're only mine to sell. Now, I'm aware that this can all sound quite dire when I shoot it off rapid fire like that, but there are some very specific things that we should have in mind to combat these issues. Within the last 20 years, the length of time in which patents and intellectual property have been allowed to be imposed has risen, ballooned exponentially out of control. Some can last almost as long as 100 years. Our first most direct political goal should be to drastically reduce these times. Instead of thinking centuries, we should be thinking decades, if not a number of years. Where should these materials go? We have a spot for them. It's called the Creative Commons. Once our materials enter the Creative Commons, they enter the public, unenclosed domain. They can be used in the creative projects of artists and individuals for their own need. Obviously, there's some certain rules in place. You cannot simply reproduce someone else's work and call it your own. Therefore, I believe that the faster our creative goods are allowed to enter this unenclosed public space, the faster our essence of humanity can be restored, bit by bit. It's important to remember while we're talking about big ideas like this, like property law, intellectual property, it's important to remember that these laws have been implemented by governments. They can therefore be retracted by governments. But governments often do not make changes themselves. Governments only change if a grassroots base of activists care enough to make them change. I fear if we do not care enough to make them change, then our art, our technologies, our creative essence, and our essence of humanity itself might just hang in the balance. Thank you very much.